Let's take a quick look at the cerebellum, which means little brain. Now I've drawn up a very rough diagram here of the cerebrum, which I've spoken about before. It makes up most of the mass of the central nervous system, the cerebrum. Then you've got the midbrain, the pons, the medulla, and then the brain, then the spinal cord. Remember, midbrain, pons, and medulla make up the brain stem. Then you've got the cerebellum right here. So that means the cerebellum is just posterior to the brainstem and inferior to the cerebrum. Now it sits within a part of the cranial cavity called the posterior cranial fossa and is separated from the occipital lobe of the cerebrum by the tentorium cerebelli. Okay? Now when you have a look at the cerebellum, it's not nice and smooth, similar to what you'd find with the cerebrum. It has all these lumps and bumps and undulations and grooves and dips and so forth. It actually is highly folded. Highly folded. And what you'll find is that these folds or sulci or fissures are relatively parallel with one another. Now the cerebellum is attached to the brainstem through what's called peduncles. So you've got these cerebellar bilateral or paired cerebellar peduncles, 3 of them, that connect them to the brainstem. So you can see we've got these folds, and what you'll find is that if we were to get rid of the cerebrum and just draw up the midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord, and then draw up the cerebellum, that if we were to do a sagittal section, okay, straight down the middle, so mid-sagittal, and then we're to have a look in, you'd find that there's going to be what looks like a branching system of white matter that comes through. Looks like a tree, and this seemingly looking tree is called the arbor vitae, the tree of life. Now, as it comes through, you're going to find that these folds from the surface I should say, come in like this. And that's basically a very rough sketch of what it looks like. So you've got the cortex of the cerebellum, similar to what you'd find with the cortex of the cerebrum, which is made up of grey matter, or the nuclei of the cells, or the cell bodies. And then you've got the deeper white matter structures, which are the fibers projecting through. And then you've actually got some more nuclei deeper into the cerebellum. All right. You can break up the cerebellum, especially when we're looking at it from this aspect, into 3 lobes. So again, we'll draw midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord, and then let's draw the cerebellum. What you'll find is you're going to have a lobe around about there, a lobe round about there, and a lobe there. This lobe here is called the anterior lobe. Anterior lobe. This lobe is called the posterior lobe. You can see why. It's the most posterior lobe, right to the back. And this is called the flocculus, or the flocculonodular lobe. So the 3 lobes are the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. Why am I telling you about these lobes? Because very generally speaking, there are certain functions dedicated to each of these lobes. Now there's a lot of overlaps, you need to be aware, but what you're going to find is that when it comes to the cerebellum and its physiology, what it does, a lot of it has to do with motor movement. Okay? Three to four things I want you to remember when it comes to the motor movement with the cerebellum. One of which is that it controls, or at least plays a role in muscle tone. That's the first one. Second one is that it plays a role in movement coordination, or muscular coordination. And the third one is balance and posture. Right, so let me get out the road. So we've got tone, coordination, balance and posture. These are some of the major roles that the cerebellum plays. And what you can actually do is, you'll find that the anterior lobe focuses a lot on focuses a lot on tone. Coordination, dedicated to the posterior lobe. And balance and posture, floccular nodular. Now, while this is not exactly how it is, there is a lot of overlap. This is a very good beginning and generalization as to the functions of these particular lobes. These lobes are also broken down into lobules. So smaller lobes are broken down into lobules, and what you'll find is that between the three of these lobes there's about 10 lobules. So around about 5 for the anterior. You'll find that there's going to be around about 4 or so for the posterior, and 1 for the floccular nodular. So 1 to 5, then 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10 for the floccular nodular. We could draw these lines through, but we're not going to do that at the moment. What I want to do is draw this again from another angle. I want to draw this from a posterior view now. Let's draw it over here so that we can compare the two. So if we were to draw the cerebellum from behind, or a posterior view, couple of things. So the first thing is, what you're going to find is that the cerebellum, just like the cerebrum, can be broken up into 2 hemispheres, and that there's actually a structure down the middle that separates these 2 hemispheres. This structure is known as the vermis. So this structure right here, separating the hemispheres, is known as the vermis, which means this is going to be the left hemisphere, this is going to be the right hemisphere. In addition to that, how do we break up these lobes when we look at it posteriorly? So what you're going to find is that you're going to have the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and then you're actually going to have the floccular nodular lobe. Let's label them so we don't forget. Anterior lobe, posterior lobe, floccular nodular lobe. And remember, you can break them up into their smaller lobules. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the anterior, 6, 7, 8, 9 for the posterior, and 10 for the floccular nodular. What else do we need to know about this? Well, one more thing which I think is quite important is that just either side of the vermis is an important functional area. Now this area here that I've highlighted in green has 2 names. It's called the intermediate zone is one name, or the paravermal zone as well. So this, let's highlight it like this. And we'll call it the intermediate zone. And I'll show you why this is important in a sec, because just like our cerebral cortex, when we look at the motor cortex, just like when we look at a cerebral cortex for the somatosensory cortex, you're going to find that there is a topographical map of the body on the cerebellum. What does this map look like? Well, it looks a little bit like this. It's actually upside down when we look at the superior aspect of it. So what can you see I've drawn? I've drawn the head with the face and the eyes. I've drawn the trunk, and so basically the body, the axial aspect of the body, and then the limbs here. Now what you can see is something specific. First thing is that, remember, the cerebellum plays a role in motor movement, or at least in maintaining tone, coordination, and balance with motor movement. Here what I've shown is that the vermis is dedicated to controlling these things for the axial musculature. So that's the muscles of midline, head, abdomen, torso, so forth. and that the limbs, the arms and the legs, are predominantly controlled by this intermediate zone. That's important. What you're also going to find is that there's another homunculus or topographical map this way as well. Now, what this also means is that while there's a map of the musculature of the body, here in the vermis and intermediate zone, there's none in what's called the lateral or lateralized, the lateral zones, I should say, because they have conversations with the cerebellum. Specifically, they have conversations with the cortex, because the cerebellum has very complex pathways. Let me give you some examples as to how it controls our physiology, or at least our motor movement. When we go to pick up a box, let's say we're helping a friend move house, and they have a box that's all taped up, and they say, look, that box is really heavy, it's about 20 kilograms, make sure you're careful when you lift it up. So what you do is, when you walk up to it, you prepare your body, okay? You're preparing the muscle tone, you're preparing your posture, you're getting everything ready to pick this up. Now what you do is, when you pick that box up and then you realize that it's actually empty and your friend was wrong, they've pointed at the wrong box, the only thing that stops you from, remember, you're tensed up so much that you're ready to pick up something so heavy that now you're picking up something so light. What stops you from flipping yourself backwards because you've got those muscles ready so much is the fact that when you pick it up, signals, sensory signals are being sent from your body or from the nervous system of those muscles up to your cerebellum, and it tweaks the signal. Now what it does is, it doesn't just go up to the cerebellum and then goes back down. It goes up to the cerebellum, it goes to the motor cortex, it goes back to the cerebellum, it also goes to the basal ganglia, which talks to the cerebellum, which also goes back out to the body. So it's a complex pathway going up, so ascending, and going down, descending. And again, it's to control tone, balance, posture, coordination, as well as planned movement as well. This is important. Planned motor movement is very important, especially when it comes to when we look at speech pathology. You may or may not know that the cerebellum, if you've got lesions or damage to the cerebellum, it can result in certain motor disorders. For example, there is something known as cerebellar ataxia, where individuals have either an fully ablated cerebellum, or the cerebellum's been taken out, or there's gross damage to the cerebellum, and they've got a problem with moving. Now, this movement may result in them needing to walk on their all fours because they have no balance. They can't maintain posture. That may be one effect. Another effect may be lesions to the cerebellum could result in somebody walking around and looking like they're drunk. The way that they're walking is not coordinated, again, not maintaining posture very well. But the cerebellum does play a role in speech too. There's been a number of studies demonstrating that the cerebellum actually controls up to 100 different muscles used in speech production. 100 different muscles used in speech production. And that they've shown that lesions to areas, or lobules I should say, 5 and 6, or 6 and 7, which is around about, remember, the first 5 is in the anterior, then 5, 6 and 7 going into the posterior, that lesions in this area, for some reason specifically the left hand side, okay, actually we're looking at this posteriorly, so this is the left hand side, so left hand side areas 5, 6 and 7 for the lobules, that lesions to these areas can result in something called dysarthria. Now, dysarthria is a problem with, it's a nervous system issue that results in motor dysfunction, not allowing an individual to articulate themselves very well. And this can mean that when it comes to speaking, they may not be able to control the volume of their voice. So they may say something too loudly, they may say something too softly. It may be quite a strong pronunciation or a weak pronunciation. They may elongate the word uncontrollably, or the word may be too short. Remember, the planned control is very important when it comes to the cerebellum. I think I might just leave it there because I think that's a good overall summary of the cerebellum. What do you need to know? Cerebellum is located inferior to the cerebrum, posterior to the brainstem, connected to the brainstem by paired peduncles. There's three major lobes, the anterior, the posterior, and the floccular nodular. These lobes can be broken down into about 10 lobules, around about 5 for the anterior, 4 for the posterior, and 1 for the floccular nodular. That when you have a look, there is a topographical map of the musculature of the body on the cerebellum. There's one inverted and one that's non-inverted, and that the axial musculature is controlled by the vermis, and that the arms and the legs are controlled predominantly by the intermediate zone, which is either side, or paravermal zones, and that the lateral areas of the cerebellum have very strong communications with the cortex of the brain. The cerebellum controls tone, balance, posture, and coordination. And I think that's a good overall beginning summary of the cerebellum. I hope it helps.